A young Israeli woman, Noa Levi, escapes captivity in Gaza, using grit, training, and sheer will to survive. Through bombed-out streets and underground tunnels, she evades death at every turn. A final sprint to the border, gunfire at her heels. A story of resilience, tension, and freedom. Will she make it? The air inside the small, dimly lit room was thick, with the stench of sweat and damp concrete. Noa Levi sat in the corner, her back against the cold wall, knees drawn to her chest. She had long since lost track of the days. Hunger gnawed at her insides, but she had learned to ignore it. Instead, she focused on her breathing. Steady, controlled, just as she had been trained. She couldn't afford to panic. Through the narrow barred window, the distant rumble of explosions echoed across Gaza. The strikes were getting closer. Each one sent a tremor through the walls, shaking dust from the ceiling. It was only a matter of time before the chaos outside bled into the inside, and Noa was waiting for that moment. She had spent weeks, perhaps longer, observing, listening, mapping every detail of her confinement. The guards rotated in predictable shifts, their conversations careless, their movements sluggish. They underestimated her, a mistake she planned to exploit. The first opportunity had come earlier that evening. One of the guards had separated her from the others, dragging her into this smaller room after a brief scuffle broke out in the main holding area. She didn't know why. Maybe they saw her as less of a threat, or maybe they had other plans. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she was alone, away from the others, away from extra eyes. Her wrists ached where the restraints had dug into her skin, but she ignored the pain. The real test was coming. Outside the door, the sound of hurried footsteps and frantic voices filled the corridor. Something was happening. Then the ground shook violently, and the lights flickered. The unmistakable whistle of an incoming airstrike sliced through the air before the world erupted in fire and sound. The explosion rocked the compound, knocking Noa sideways. A deafening ringing filled her ears, and for a moment she couldn't see through the swirling dust. Then she heard it. Shouts of confusion, the scrape of overturned furniture, the panicked clatter of boots. Chaos! Her chance! With adrenaline surging through her veins, she forced herself up. The impact had jarred the flimsy metal door ajar. She pressed against it, pushing it open just enough to peer outside. Smoke billowed down the corridor, and through the haze she saw one of the guards slumped against the wall, unmoving. Noa moved quickly. She crouched beside the fallen man, her hand shaking only slightly as she checked his pulse. Dead. His rifle lay just out of reach, but she didn't dare take it. Too loud. Too risky. Instead, she reached for the knife strapped to his belt and slid it free, the cold steel grounding her. The next few seconds would determine everything. She exhaled slowly, then slipped into the smoke-filled corridor. The only way out was forward. Noa moved through the corridor like a shadow, her steps deliberate, her breath shallow. The building groaned around her, the aftermath of the explosion still sending debris trickling from above. She kept low, knife clenched in her grip, every nerve in her body alert. Ahead, muffled voices carried through the smoke. The guards were regrouping, shouting orders. Their footsteps hurried. She pressed herself against the crumbling wall, heart hammering. She needed to get out before they restored order. A broken doorway gaped to her left, leading into a supply room. She slipped inside, her fingers brushing against metal shelving. The dim light flickered, casting jagged shadows. Her gaze swept over the supply skins, sacks of grain, a row of water bottles. She grabbed one, twisting the cap off with trembling fingers, gulping down just enough to wet her parched throat before securing it in her jacket. A sudden noise, footsteps just outside. Noa tensed, holding her breath as a shadow passed the doorway. Then another. The guards were searching. She had to keep moving. She edged toward the back of the room and found another exit. A low, half-broken window leading into an alley filled with rubble. She slipped through, landing in a crouch on the other side. The city stretched before her, dark and torn apart by war. Fires flickered in the distance. Drone surveillance buzzed somewhere overhead. But Noa wasn't focused on that. She was focused on getting out. The streets were a maze of destruction. Noa moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows, her every step measured. She knew better than to run outright. Speed was secondary to silence. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid scent burning her throat. In the distance, gunfire crackled, but it was far enough away not to pose an immediate threat. She navigated through the ruins, slipping between collapsed buildings, staying out of sight. Her mind worked through the mental map she had built over her time in captivity, piecing together an escape route. The tunnels! She had to reach them. After what felt like an eternity, she found an entrance. A jagged hole where a missile had collapsed part of an underground passage. Noa hesitated only a second before slipping inside, the darkness swallowing her whole. Inside the tunnel, the air was damp and stale. The walls dripped with condensation, the ground uneven beneath her feet. She moved carefully, her ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The tunnels were dangerous, but they were also her best shot at avoiding detection. Then, a problem. She reached a collapsed section. Rubble blocked her way forward. She cursed under her breath, running her fingers over the obstruction. Too much to clear by hand. She had to find another way. Retracing her steps, she found a narrow passage branching off to the side. She took it, heart pounding, the darkness pressing in around her. The walls felt closer here, the space tightening. Then, voices, close. Noa froze, pressing herself against the damp stone. A patrol, just meters away. She held her breath, waiting as they passed. The sound of boots on loose gravel murmured Arabic words she couldn't make out. Then, silent. She waited a beat longer before moving again, every movement deliberate. After what felt like hours, she saw it. Light, faint but unmistakable. An exit. She quickened her pace, emerging from the tunnel into open air. The border was still ahead, distant but reachable. All she had to do now was survive the final stretch. The night air was sharp against Noa's skin as she moved toward the border, every step measured, every breath controlled. The open terrain ahead offered no cover, just a barren stretch of land between her and freedom. She scanned the distance, no movement. No sounds, except the distant echo of war. The last stretch had to be perfect. She ran. Her boots pounded against the dirt, lungs burning, every muscle screaming for her to stop. But she didn't. Spotlights swept the area behind her, voices shouting. Then gunfire. A burst of dust exploded near her feet. She pushed harder. The fence came into view. Beyond it, Israel, safety. A final sprint. Then, blinding lights. Figures rushed toward her. Uniforms, rifles raised. But she knew. These were her own. Noa staggered, her strength finally giving way. She collapsed to her knees, gasping. Hands reached for her, voices urgent, but she couldn't make out the words. The last thing she saw, before darkness took her, was the sky. Vast, open, free.